Yeah, he's a big name, right?
Huge. We've got this excerpt from the British Journal of Sociology of Education. It gets pretty dense, but
Don't worry, I'll break it down.
exactly. We're going to make it make sense.
For sure.
You know how some people just seem to breeze through school while others struggle?
Yeah, I mean, we've all seen that.
Bourdieu's work might give us some clues about why.
It's not just about, being smart or having money.
Right.
Bourdieu argues there's this thing called habitus. It plays a big role.
Habitus. Okay, that sounds a little intimidating, to be honest.
It is a big concept.
Could you break it down for us? What does it actually mean?
Sure. Think of it as like a set of guidelines you download from your culture.
Okay.
Almost like a mental and behavioral code. It shapes how you see the world, how you act, even how you think. And it's mostly influenced by, this social class you grew up in.
So it's not just about the actual habits, but a deeper way of being.
Yeah, almost unconscious, you could say.
Wow, that's fascinating.
And the article, it argues that this habitus, it can play a bigger role in how well you do in school than, say, your family's wealth.
Right.
Or even their connections.
Wow, that's pretty radical.
Yeah.
I'm already starting to
Makes you think.
rethink my own experiences in school.
Exactly.
So where does the school itself fit into all of this?
Right.
Is it just this neutral space where everyone has an equal shot?
Well, not according to Bourdieu. He suggests schools aren't just reflecting these social differences.
Right.
They actually create a very specific type of habitus themselves.
Go on. So schools are making things worse.
It's complicated. It's more nuanced than that.
Okay.
Think about the language used in classrooms, or how some subjects are valued over others.
Right.
Even the emphasis on sitting still, raising your hand, it's all part of a culture that might feel very natural to some students, but totally alien to others. Like some kids already speak the school's language.
Yeah.
And others are trying to catch up from day one.
Totally. Have you ever felt that, like, you were an outsider because the way things were taught just didn't...
Yeah, definitely
fixed,
happens
yeah.
to a lot of people.
Right. So this is where Bourdieu brings up arbitrary versus necessary culture, right?
Exactly. He says what schools teach, it's partly arbitrary.
Okay.
Meaning it reflects the values of the dominant culture,
Yeah.
which aren't necessarily better than anyone else's.
So some of what we learn is just one particular way of seeing the world.
Right. But there's also a necessary culture in schools, like learning to read, write, think critically, basic skills everyone needs.
Yeah.
The problem is when this arbitrary culture clashes with a student's habitus.
Right. So it creates this disconnect.
It can make it harder for some students to engage with the material.
It's not just about lacking skills. It's about feeling like an outsider.
Yeah, exactly. It's about how comfortable you feel in the school culture. And that can make a huge difference in a student's motivation. And ultimately, their success, right?
That's true.
Makes a big difference.
This makes me wonder, can schools even bridge that gap? Can they create a system that works for everyone, given these differences in habitus,
That's the big question.
Yeah.
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
The article, it digs into whether schools can really level the playing field. And Bourdieu, he seems skeptical about a one-size-fits-all approach.
Really?
Yeah.
Why is that? Is it just too hard to cater to so many different backgrounds?
It's more about recognizing that some kids come pre-programmed, so to speak,
Yeah.
for the way schools operate, thanks to their habitus.
Oh, interesting.
Catching up and can be a real struggle when the system itself doesn't recognize, those fundamental differences.
So even with good intentions, schools might be perpetuating these inequalities.
It's possible. And it's not just about what happens in the classroom. Bourdieu also highlights the role of family attitudes.
Wait, so are we blaming parents now?
No, not at all.
Okay.
It's more about how families develop certain attitudes toward education based on their social class and the opportunities they see, for people like us.
Right.
So a working class family might unintentionally limit their child's aspirations just by reflecting their own reality.
Like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right, exactly.
That's a powerful concept.
It is.
Makes you wonder how much of what we consider natural talent is actually shaped by these...
Social forces.
It's a big factor.
And before we get too deep into that, I think it's important to say that not everyone agrees with Bourdieu.
For sure.
He's a controversial figure.
Definitely. Some critics say his ideas are too deterministic, like your background completely dictates your destiny.
Oh, so you're doomed from the start.
That's a common misinterpretation. The article pushes back on that idea, emphasizing it's more about probabilities, not predetermined outcomes.
Okay, that's a bit less bleak.
A little less doom and gloom.
So you're not trapped, but it creates a starting point. Yeah, that influences the path you're likely to take.
Makes sense.
And Bourdieu's work helps us understand how those probabilities are created and how we can, potentially shift them toward a more equitable system.
That's the goal, right?
Exactly.
Well, this is a lot to take in.
It is a lot.
We've covered habitus, the school's role, family influences, and even touched on some criticisms.
Yeah, just scratching the surface.
But how do Bourdieu's ideas compare to other sociological theories on education? That's what I'm wondering.
That's a great question, and we'll get into that.
All right. Sounds good. I'm ready for more.
Let's do it.
All right. So we've covered a lot of ground with habitus.
Yeah, we have.
The school's role, and even how families kind of influence our perceptions of education.
Definitely.
But how do Bourdieu's ideas, stack up against other sociological theories on education?
That's a great question. It's important to remember that Bourdieu's work didn't just appear out of nowhere.
Right.
It both builds on and challenges existing theories about power and inequality in schools. For example, back in the 70s, Bowles and Gintis, they put forth this idea called the correspondence principle.
Correspondence principle.
Yeah,
Okay.
Sounds fancy, right?
A little bit, yeah. What's that all about?
Essentially, they argued that schools function to reproduce the kind of workforce that capitalism needs. So the structure, the hierarchies within the school system, they actually mirror those of the workplace.
Oh, interesting.
It's like a training ground for our future roles in the economic machine.
So it's not just about learning facts and figures, but prepping us for a certain place in society.
Exactly. You're learning how to, follow orders, be punctual, all those
Being a
things.
good worker.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so how does this connect back to Bourdieu's concept of habitus?
Well, think about it. Our habitus is largely shaped by our social class, right? Which already kind of predisposes us towards a certain place in society. Bowles and Gintis would argue that the education system, it reinforces this, by rewarding the behaviors and skills that align with that predetermined position.
So it's like a double whammy.
Yeah, you could say that.
You're socialized into a certain role by your upbringing, and then the education system kind of confirms that trajectory through its structure and values.
Right, like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Makes you wonder, how much free will we actually have?
Big question, right? It's this interplay of individual agency and, social structures.
Yeah.
And that's what makes Bourdieu's work so compelling.
Yeah.
He's not saying we're robots, but we do need to understand how these forces shape our choices.
I see what you mean. It's like seeing the Matrix.
Exactly.
All these little things in school, they suddenly take on a whole new meaning.
Right, like even something as simple as the emphasis on punctuality
Right.
could be part of this bigger system.
Yeah, because being on time is super important in certain professions.
Exactly, like white-collar jobs.
But other types of work might have more flexible schedules.
Right.
So by instilling this value of punctuality, schools are subtly preparing kids for different types of work based on the dominant culture.
Exactly, and it's not just punctuality. There are countless ways this hidden curriculum shapes our values.
Hidden curriculum, that's a good phrase.
Right. It prepares us, consciously or unconsciously, for different roles.
Wow. So Bourdieu is urging us to, critically examine these taken-for-granted aspects of education.
He is.
And see how they contribute to social inequality.
Exactly.
This is really making me rethink everything I learned in school. It's fascinating, but also a bit disheartening.
It can be a lot to take in.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So if we accept this argument that schools play a role in maintaining social inequality, what can we do about it?
Right. That's the challenge, isn't it? And Bourdieu wasn't just a theorist. He was deeply concerned with social justice.
Okay.
He believed that education could be a tool for change,
Okay.
but only if it acknowledges how it reproduces these inequalities.
So no more pretending everyone starts on an equal playing field.
Exactly. We need to work against those systemic disadvantages.
Actively work against them.
Yes. He advocated for something called pedagogical work.
Okay. What is that?
It's a conscious effort to make the curriculum and teaching practices more inclusive.
So instead of forcing everyone into one mold, we meet students where they are.
Right. And give them the tools they need to succeed, regardless of their background.
That sounds great in theory, But how would that even look in practice?
It would require a pretty fundamental shift in thinking. Teachers would need training to recognize and value different forms of, cultural capital.
So like valuing street smarts as much as book smarts.
Exactly. It's about broadening our definition of what is valuable knowledge.
Recognizing that intelligence comes in many forms.
Right. It's influenced by cultural experiences.
Yeah, that makes sense. But that also sounds incredibly challenging to put into practice.
You're right. It's a complex issue, no easy answers. But Bourdieu believed that raising awareness was the crucial first step.
So knowledge is power.
In a way, yes. Once people understand how the system works, they can demand more equitable practices.
Right, like shining a light on those invisible forces.
Exactly. He believed that once we understand these mechanisms, we can start to challenge them.
But even with awareness, wouldn't it take a monumental effort to change how schools operate at such a fundamental level?
It would. It would require a complete overhaul of how we approach education.
Wow.
From the curriculum to teacher training to how we assess learning. It's not about tweaking a few things. It's about rethinking the entire system.
So Bourdieu is calling for a revolution in education.
You could say that.
A fundamental shift in how we think about learning and success.
Yes. It's an ambitious vision, but it's a fight worth having, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It is. As we go deeper, I keep thinking about some real-world examples of how Bourdieu's concepts play out.
Oh, like what?
Well, the whole debate around standardized testing, for example.
Oh, that's a perfect example. Bourdieu argued that what we consider intelligence, it often just reflects the values of the dominant culture. And standardized tests, by design, they measure a very specific set of skills and knowledge that align with those values.
So are you saying these tests are biased towards certain groups?
It's not that kids from less privileged backgrounds are less intelligent.
Right.
It's that they haven't had the same opportunities to develop those specific skills being tested,
So it's not about innate ability,
Yeah.
but access.
Exactly. And this is where cultural capital comes in.
Right. Remind me what that means again?
Yeah, so cultural capital refers to the knowledge, skills, and dispositions that are valued by the dominant culture.
Right.
It's like a currency
Oh, right.
that gives you an advantage in certain social settings, including education.
So it's like having the secret password to unlock certain doors.
Exactly. And those passwords are often passed down through families and networks.
Right. So schools, consciously or not, they reward students who come in with that capital, which puts others at a disadvantage.
Yeah, like starting a race a few steps behind.
Exactly.
It's not just about effort. It's about the resources you have access to.
Which are often determined by your background.
Exactly.
This makes me think about the debate around school funding
Oh, absolutely.
and how resources are distributed so unevenly.
Right. Schools in wealthier neighborhoods, they often have more resources, better facilities, better teachers.
We can offer a richer learning environment.
Exactly. And more opportunities for kids to develop that cultural capital.
Which further perpetuates the cycle.
It does.
The rich get richer, the poor get poorer.
It's a simplification, but it highlights the core issue.
Yeah.
Bourdieu helps us understand how all these issues, from testing to funding to cultural capital, are interconnected.
It's all connected.
And they contribute to this reproduction of social inequality.
This is seriously eye-opening. I'm seeing education in a whole new light.
I know, right?
It's both fascinating and disheartening.
It is a lot to take in.
It is. It really is. Why don't we take a moment to gather our thoughts and then come back to wrap up this exploration of Bourdieu's ideas.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, we're back. Ready to wrap up our Bourdieu deep dive?
I'm ready.
This has been, honestly, one of the most thought-provoking conversations I've had in a while.
It's heavy stuff, that's for sure.
It is. One thing that really stuck with me was Bourdieu's emphasis on symbolic violence in the education system.
Oh, yeah.
Symbolic violence. I mean, it sounds intense. What does he even mean by that?
It's not about physical violence, thankfully.
Okay.
It's more subtle. He describes it as a way that power is exercised through symbolic means.
Okay.
Like language, culture, what we consider legitimate knowledge, all of that.
So it's like this hidden power dynamic.
Exactly.
That shapes how we see the world and how we fit into it.
Yeah, like the education system often presents the dominant culture's values, their beliefs.
Right.
As if they're the only valid ones.
And that's where Habitus comes back in.
Right. Totally. If your habitus already aligns with that dominant culture,
You probably don't even notice it.
you just accept the system.
Internalize those values.
Exactly.
But what about students whose habitus doesn't match up?
That's where the harm comes in, unfortunately.
They must feel this symbolic violence so much more.
They're constantly getting the message, implicitly or explicitly,
Yeah.
that their culture, their language, their way of seeing the world, it's somehow less than.
Like they need to conform.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly alienating.
I bet.
It's not just learning, it's adapting to a whole new set of norms.
They can feel hostile, even.
Right. And that's what makes this symbolic violence so insidious.
Yeah.
It impacts a student's self-worth, their belief in themselves.
Makes them question their own capabilities.
Exactly.
So how do we combat this? It seems so deeply rooted in the system.
It's a huge challenge, no doubt.
Yeah.
But Bourdieu would say the first step is just recognizing it exists.
Okay.
Once we see how it operates, we can start to identify those structures that perpetuate it.
Right.
And then work to dismantle them.
So what can schools actually do to create a more inclusive environment?
Well, diversifying the curriculum is crucial, for one.
Showcasing different perspectives.
Yeah, disrupt the idea that there's only one right way of knowing.
Valuing different forms of knowledge.
Exactly.
Making sure all students see themselves reflected.
That's so important.
And it's not just about the content, right?
Right.
It's the language we use, how we assess students.
Yeah, those small cultural norms that can alienate.
Creating a space where everyone feels valued.
Safe to be themselves.
Not pressured to conform.
Exactly.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation.
It has.
If Bourdieu were alive today,
Hmm.
what do you think he'd say about education now? Would he see any progress?
I think he'd acknowledge there have been some positive changes, for sure.
Okay.
More awareness of diversity, equity.
But would he be satisfied?
I think he'd still be pretty critical, honestly. He'd point out that while we've made some strides,
Yeah.
those underlying structures, they're still there.
So we have a long way to go.
We do. But I also think he'd be hopeful.
Okay.
He saw education as a potential site for transformation. By
Yeah.
raising awareness, challenging the status quo.
We can create a better system.
That's for all students.
So it's not a lost cause.
Not at all. It's an ongoing struggle, and Bourdieu gives us the tools to understand it.
To fight for a better future.
Exactly.
Well said. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It has.
And hopefully inspired some of you listening to take action. Education is too important.
It really is.
We all have a role to play in creating a system that truly serves everyone.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
Thanks for having me.
And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us.
We appreciate you.
We hope you learned something new and feel inspired to make a difference in your own communities. Until next time.